"Evelyn, you need to see this right now," Michael said, holding the envelope with a hesitant hand. I paused mid-step in the kitchen, my fingers still on the handle of the teapot, and felt the room narrow around me. The dining room smelled faintly of roasted chicken and rosemary, the sunlight through the half-drawn curtains casting long shadows over the polished oak table where 3 empty plates waited. I took a slow breath and moved to the table, sitting down without a word, noticing how Michael avoided my eyes, how Sophia stood by the doorway with an expression that was carefully neutral, her hands folded over a stack of napkins. My heart beat in quiet rhythms, the kind that sound louder in the silent spaces between words. Michael placed the envelope in front of me, and I looked at it, noting the familiar handwriting that suggested both care and caution, and I felt a flicker of curiosity edged with dread. "What is it?" I asked softly, and the words barely disturbed the calm. Michael swallowed and said, "It's something I think you need to know about the house, about the decisions made after Dad passed." I nodded, still calm, letting him continue. The room seemed to hold its breath. Sophia adjusted her stance slightly, as though the air had thickened. I slid the envelope open slowly, revealing papers that looked official, letters from lawyers and banking statements carefully dated and annotated. I glanced at the numbers, the transfers, the references to the property, and my stomach shifted, a cold awareness creeping in. I leaned back, letting the chair bear my weight, observing them. There was no immediate panic, no sharp accusation, only a quiet, growing clarity. The house we built together over decades, the kitchen where Dad and I cooked countless Sunday meals, the living room filled with photographs and laughter, it all seemed to whisper its history at me in that moment. I could feel the tension in Michael's jaw, the tight press of Sophia's lips, the careful avoidance of their gaze, and I understood the story the numbers told before I even spoke. "You've been keeping this from me," I said quietly, more to the silence than to them, and the words were steady. Measured, the kind that draw attention without raising voices. Michael shifted, Sophia's eyes flicked briefly to the floor, and I allowed myself a single, small exhale. I studied their expressions, cataloguing the subtle tells, the quick glance at the clock, the slight stiffening of shoulders, the brief clench of hands. I folded the papers back into the envelope, placing it gently on the table, as though I had just handled something fragile. "Thank you for showing me," I said, keeping the tone even, calm, deliberate. I felt a new focus settle in, a plan beginning to form not in haste, but in careful, measured steps. The air in the dining room remained heavy, charged with unspoken truths, and I sat there, letting them feel the quiet strength of patience, the weight of observation, the calm before any action would unfold, knowing that the story had just begun and every moment from here on would be a page in its unfolding, every glance, every word, every silence carrying the potential of revelation and the promise of careful reckoning. The following morning, I moved through the house with deliberate calm, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint clatter of dishes my only companions. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors, highlighting small imperfections I had always intended to fix but never prioritized. I prepared breakfast, pouring coffee into the china mugs I had set aside for special occasions, arranging plates with slices of toast and fresh fruit. Each movement was precise, almost ritualistic, as if performing the familiar routines might anchor me in steadiness amidst the currents of recent revelations. I paused at the counter, listening to the faint chirping of birds outside, and considered the past week in quiet reflection. Michael had left early for the office, his brief nod more habitual than engaged, and Sophia lingered in the kitchen doorway, offering polite smiles but none of the warmth that once existed. Their conversations had become sparse, calculated, measured, leaving gaps filled only by silence and unspoken tension. I observed the way Sophia adjusted her sleeve, the subtle hesitation before taking a sip of her coffee, the slight stiffness in her posture that spoke volumes without words. I set the table for lunch in the dining room, lining up utensils and napkins with care, and noticed the sunlight catching the edge of the silverware, reflecting tiny prisms onto the tablecloth. Each glint reminded me of the meticulous attention I had poured into this home over decades, the love and effort embedded in its walls and furnishings. I walked past the bookshelves, tracing fingers along spines, remembering the times I had chosen each volume thoughtfully, intending to share stories and knowledge with Michael and Lily. The quiet echoed the contrast of what was and what should have been, a subtle tension in the air that made each familiar corner of the house feel alien. I heard the faint rustle of a newspaper through the doorway, glanced up, and noticed the living room sofa arranged differently, cushions slightly askew, as if someone had made deliberate alterations in my absence. My mind catalogued each detail without judgment, simply noting the inconsistencies, the small shifts in behavior and environment that together painted a larger, more troubling picture. The clock ticked steadily, the sound grounding me, each second passing without fanfare, reminding me of the patience I had cultivated over the years, the careful observation that now served as my guide. I moved from room to room, performing minor chores, adjusting a misplaced vase here, straightening a photo frame there, allowing each action to reinforce a sense of control, a quiet reclamation of order. At times, I paused, looking out the window at the garden where spring flowers were beginning to bloom, their colors vibrant and unassuming, a gentle counterpoint to the storm of contemplation within me. The sun climbed higher, warming the wooden floors, and I let myself feel the simple satisfaction of morning routines, the act of maintaining life within these walls, while beneath the surface, awareness and reflection intertwined, mapping the subtleties of human behavior and intentions around me. In each movement, I remained aware of the patterns forming, of the unspoken dynamics at play, letting observation replace speculation, and patience temper judgment, knowing that understanding the landscape fully was the first step before any conversation, any response, could be crafted. By mid-morning, the house had settled into a quiet rhythm, the hum of the air conditioning mingling with the distant sounds of traffic outside the window. I moved deliberately through the living room, noting how sunlight fell across the patterned rug, illuminating small areas of dust that had gone unnoticed the day before. On the mantel, photographs of family vacations and birthdays stood in silent testimony to years of careful planning and shared moments, yet the expressions captured in those images seemed to whisper reminders of absent warmth. I poured another cup of coffee, the aroma filling the kitchen, and took a slow sip, allowing the flavor to ground me as I considered the subtle shifts I had observed over the past week. Michael had come and gone, his attention constantly drawn to his phone, fingers tracing messages with attention I had come to recognize, while Sophia moved through the house with polite efficiency, placing items just so, never lingering, never acknowledging the weight of the space or the memories it held. I carried a stack of mail to the table, sorting through envelopes with practiced care, noticing patterns in the bills, the statements, the occasional personal note that hinted at intentions hidden beneath normal appearances. Each detail added clarity to a picture I had begun to see taking shape, quiet but undeniable. I walked to the window, observing Lily playing in the yard, her laughter light and unburdened, and I felt a mixture of relief and resolve, understanding that her innocence allowed her perspective free from the complications I now navigated. Returning to the kitchen, I arranged the morning dishes in the sink, aligning plates and cups with precision, the motion steadying my thoughts and sharpening my focus. In the hallway, the floorboards creaked under my steps, a familiar sound that reminded me of long afternoons spent sharing stories and guidance with Michael when he was small, a reminder of the foundation upon which all else had been built. I paused to adjust a curtain, the sunlight catching the fabric just so, and felt the subtle energy of observation deepen, a quiet awareness of the interplay of movement and silence in the household. The quiet persisted, a canvas on which I could project both understanding and strategy, allowing the small patterns of behavior, the fleeting expressions, and the deliberate choices made by those around me to be seen and considered without interruption or distraction. I allowed the room and its rhythms to speak, listening to the faint sounds of the refrigerator, the distant barking of a neighbor's dog, the muted honk of a car passing by, and through it all, I traced the outlines of relationships, intentions, and concealed motives, letting awareness guide the next steps with care, patience, and deliberate intention. By early afternoon, the sun had shifted higher, spilling brighter light across the kitchen floor, highlighting the grains in the oak cabinets and the slight imperfections in the tile grout that I had long ago intended to clean. I moved with deliberate care, setting out fresh water for Lily's lunch and aligning the silverware on the table as I always had, each placement precise, a quiet assertion of order. Michael had called to confirm a meeting at work, his voice polite but distant, carrying the undertones of routine rather than genuine engagement. Sophia lingered briefly to ask a question about the garden plants, her tone neutral, her movements controlled, and I noted the subtle hesitation before she spoke, the careful attention to posture, the fleeting glance at the wall clock, as if measuring my response before speaking. I nodded, acknowledging her question without inflection, my focus steady on the rhythm of daily tasks and the consistency of observation. I carried a basket of laundry to the bedroom, pausing to adjust a photograph on the dresser, one taken decades earlier of Michael as a boy, holding a soccer trophy, his smile radiant and unburdened. I let the memory settle, the warmth of past moments tempered by the quiet awareness of the present, of patterns emerging in their behavior that had previously been subtle and now revealed themselves in small repetitions, the choice of seating in the dining room, the order of chores performed, the avoidance of certain topics, the carefully timed steps through the house. I moved to the window overlooking the driveway, noting the way the light bounced off the silver car parked outside, and I observed the trajectory of daily life as it intersected with the patterns I had begun to recognize. I made a cup of tea and carried it to the living room, sitting in the armchair that had always been my place of contemplation, and I let the house speak through its silence, listening to the faint hum of electronics, the distant wind moving branches against the windows, and the subtle sounds of Lily's quiet play outside. Each detail accumulated, forming a map of behavior, intentions, and possible motivations without words being spoken, a silent narrative unfolding around me. I reviewed the correspondence and bills once more, noting recurring names, slight discrepancies, small details that suggested deliberate oversight or concealment, yet I maintained a calm, measured approach, cataloguing without judgment, planning without haste. The afternoon passed in this quiet intensity, a delicate balance of observation, reflection, and the collection of evidence that would inform the decisions to come. I moved between rooms, performing familiar tasks, straightening cushions, dusting surfaces lightly, aligning pictures on the wall, each act a subtle reinforcement of presence and awareness, a quiet assertion that I was both witness and participant in the evolving dynamics of my family, ready to act when the time was right, yet patient enough to allow understanding to fully settle before making any move. The late afternoon light filtered through the living room windows, casting elongated shadows across the floor and highlighting the soft textures of the couch and area rug. I moved quietly, carrying a folded throw blanket from the sofa to the armchair I favored, the familiar weight grounding me in the rhythm of my home. Each step I took was deliberate, my attention drawn to the small details that others might overlook, a slightly crooked picture frame, a dust-free streak along the windowsill. The gentle ticking of the antique wall clock that had always marked the passage of time in this house. I poured myself a second cup of tea, letting the warmth fill my hands and the aroma settle in the room, and I considered the patterns I had noticed over the past days. Michael had returned briefly from work, exchanging polite greetings with Lily, who ran past him to grab a book from the shelf, yet his eyes lingered on the phone in his hand more than on the interaction around him. Sophia, attentive to the household routines, moved with quiet efficiency, arranging a small stack of mail and straightening items on the counter, her every action precise and intentional, revealing nothing directly but speaking volumes through gesture and timing. I walked slowly to the kitchen window, watching the shadows of tree branches shift across the yard as a soft breeze stirred the air, carrying faint sounds from the neighborhood outside. I noted the care with which Lily tended to her toys, the concentration in her small movements, and I allowed myself a brief smile, appreciating her innocence amidst the careful observation of adult behavior. Returning to the table, I arranged letters and documents into neat stacks, cataloging without urgency, allowing my mind to map out the subtleties of interactions and potential intentions. Each small action I performed, aligning chairs, smoothing tablecloths, adjusting a vase of flowers, was a deliberate assertion of presence, a quiet statement that the house and its memories remained mine to steward. I paused by the bookshelf, brushing a finger along the spines of books collected over decades, and reflected on the many evenings spent sharing stories, offering guidance, and witnessing growth. The silence of the house was not emptiness but a canvas upon which observation, patience, and awareness could be painted, capturing nuances that others overlooked. I carried a few notes from the counter to my chair, sitting and reviewing them with meticulous care, noting patterns in dates, correspondences, and small omissions that had previously gone unnoticed. Each realization settled with a quiet weight, shaping the contours of understanding without a single raised voice or dramatic gesture. The afternoon continued in this measured, deliberate pace, each moment reinforcing the balance between awareness and restraint, reflection and preparation, observation and strategy, as I quietly took stock of the household, the relationships, and the subtle dynamics that would inform the steps to follow. The sun began to dip lower, casting a soft golden hue across the living room, stretching shadows and highlighting the textures of the furniture and framed photographs along the walls. I moved through the house with calm precision, noticing the subtle changes in the environment, small details that others might overlook, like the slightly uneven placement of a cushion or the faint indentation in the carpet where a chair had been moved. I poured another cup of tea, the warm steam rising gently, and carried it to my chair by the window, taking a slow, measured sip, letting the quiet of the house settle around me. Michael came in briefly, offering a polite nod and a quick comment about his day at the office, but his attention was split, eyes flicking to his phone as if the device held more importance than the room itself. Sophia passed by in the kitchen, rearranging items on the counter with subtle efficiency, her movements deliberate and controlled, her face composed yet betraying just a hint of tension in the set of her shoulders. I observed these behaviors with steady awareness, cataloging each subtle cue, each micro-expression, the timing of movements, the slight pauses before speech. I walked slowly into the hallway, noting how the light from the front windows reflected across the polished hardwood floor, illuminating small scratches and marks that had accumulated over years of family life, evidence of moments lived, of laughter, of growth, of change. I paused at the stairway, looking up to the second floor, imagining the quiet rooms where memories had been made and considering how those memories intersected with the patterns I now recognized. I returned to the dining room, straightening the table settings, aligning napkins and silverware with deliberate care, each action reinforcing presence and attention. I allowed myself to linger on the details, noticing the interplay of light and shadow, the reflections in the polished surfaces, the faint sounds from the street outside blending with the soft hum of the refrigerator, creating a backdrop for contemplation. I reviewed documents and notes I had gathered, checking for consistency, cross-referencing details, letting patterns emerge quietly in my mind without the need for urgency or outward display. The house felt alive with subtle signals, each item, each movement, each sound contributing to a fuller understanding of the dynamics around me. I walked through the rooms again, adjusting small things here and there, smoothing surfaces, aligning books and pictures, reinforcing a sense of control and presence, while internally mapping the relationships, the unspoken intentions, and the pathways of behavior that had become increasingly clear over time. The evening approached slowly, and I remained in measured awareness, patient and observant, letting understanding accumulate naturally, preparing myself to navigate what would come next with careful deliberation and quiet, composed insight. The evening settled softly over the house, casting long, warm shadows that stretched across the polished hardwood floors and the neatly arranged furniture. I moved slowly through the living room, pausing to adjust a picture frame slightly tilted on the wall and smoothing the folds of a throw blanket over the arm of the sofa, small gestures that restored order and reflected careful attention. Outside, the faint hum of a neighbor's lawnmower had long ceased, leaving a quiet punctuated only by the soft rustling of leaves against the windows. Michael had stepped out for a late meeting, leaving a brief voicemail confirming he would be home later, his tone businesslike, detached, a reminder of the shift in our interactions over the past weeks. Sophia lingered in the kitchen for a moment, straightening utensils and aligning coffee mugs, her movements precise, her expressions composed yet betraying a subtle tightness in her jaw, a quiet indicator of her awareness of tension she could not openly address. I poured myself a cup of herbal tea, the steam rising gently, and carried it to the window seat, letting my gaze travel over the yard where shadows of trees moved with the gentle breeze, observing Lily as she organized her toys, her concentration unbroken and serene, a calming presence that contrasted with the carefully measured behaviors of the adults. I let the room speak to me in its quiet way, noting the faint creak of floorboards, the soft echo of footsteps, the subtle alignment of items in the kitchen and living room, all small signals that, when combined, mapped a pattern of careful navigation and concealed intentions. I took a slow sip of tea, feeling warmth spread through my hands and chest, and allowed thoughts to settle, cataloguing the day's subtle observations, a glance, a hesitation before speech, a careful placement of an object. Each detail built upon the previous, forming a tapestry of understanding without confrontation, a quiet mastery of awareness and patience. I moved from room to room, performing small tasks, aligning cushions, dusting the edges of tables, adjusting the angle of a lamp, each action deliberate, reinforcing presence, demonstrating attentive stewardship of the space while internally tracing the patterns of behavior unfolding around me. The fading light painted the walls in golden hues, highlighting the textures of familiar objects and the subtle imperfections of the space, a reminder of the life lived here, of years invested in love and care. I allowed each moment to flow with quiet purpose, observing without interruption, reflecting without judgment, and preparing mentally for the next steps in navigating the household dynamics. The house was alive with small signals, a chorus of subtleties that spoke more than any words could, and I moved through it with composed attentiveness, steady and deliberate, each movement reinforcing calm awareness and thoughtful observation, laying the groundwork for the understanding and decisions that would follow. The evening deepened, casting the house in a gentle twilight that softened the edges of the furniture and made the polished floors glow with muted warmth. I moved deliberately through the rooms, noting the subtle shifts in light and shadow, the way the air held a quiet stillness that encouraged reflection. I carried a tray with a small assortment of snacks and a fresh pot of tea, setting it carefully on the coffee table, arranging each item with precision, as though each placement could influence the subtle currents of thought and behavior around me. Outside, the last hints of sunlight filtered through the blinds, brushing across the walls and leaving streaks of gold that seemed to illuminate the details I had been observing throughout the day. Michael had returned briefly, his conversation limited to practical matters, scheduling commitments and reminders, his tone cordial but distant, a reflection of the careful boundaries he now maintained in our interactions. Sophia moved quietly through the kitchen, arranging dishes and wiping counters with deliberate care, her movements controlled and precise, a subtle rhythm that contrasted with the warmth and informality that once filled this space. I allowed myself to focus on the small details, noting each gesture, each pause, each carefully measured movement, cataloguing them in my mind, constructing a fuller understanding of their behaviors and intentions. I paused at the window overlooking the garden, watching the soft rustle of the trees and the way shadows stretched across the lawn, observing Lily as she explored her toys, her attention unbroken, her presence a calm counterpoint to the subtle tension between the adults. I returned to the dining room, aligning the silverware and straightening the tablecloth, each motion deliberate, each act reinforcing the awareness and patience I had cultivated over the day. I took the envelope from earlier and reviewed its contents again, tracing dates, amounts, and references, letting the patterns become clearer, the implications more vivid, all without urgency or visible emotion. Each moment in the house, each movement of light, each shift in posture and glance, contributed to a layered understanding that unfolded quietly but persistently. I moved from room to room, dusting, adjusting, observing, reinforcing a sense of calm authority, the quiet assertion that I was present, aware, and prepared. The house itself seemed to respond to this attentive presence, settling into the rhythm I set, and in the dimming light, I felt the subtle interplay of observation, reflection, and anticipation, the careful balance of patience and awareness that would guide the decisions to come, as I remained steady, composed, and fully attuned to the nuances of the day and the people around me. The night had fully settled over the house, casting the rooms in muted shadows that softened the edges of furniture and walls, turning every familiar object into a quiet witness of the day's observations. I moved through the house with calm deliberation, straightening a throw pillow on the couch, adjusting the position of a lamp, each act precise, purposeful, a subtle reinforcement of presence and awareness. Outside, the gentle breeze stirred the leaves, creating a soft rustling sound that mingled with the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant car passing on the street, a quiet symphony of ordinary life layered over the undercurrents of tension within the household. Michael had returned briefly from a late meeting, his words concise and courteous, yet carrying the weight of habitual detachment, while Sophia quietly moved through the kitchen, aligning dishes, wiping surfaces, her movements controlled, her expression composed, masking the subtleties I had begun to recognize in her posture and timing. I paused at the window overlooking the garden, watching Lily quietly arranging her toys, her concentration complete, the innocence of her play a sharp contrast to the careful navigation of behavior by the adults around her. I took a slow sip of herbal tea, feeling warmth settle in my hands and chest, and allowed the quiet of the home to inform my reflection. Each small observation collected over the past days, slight hesitations, micro-expressions, the rhythm of footsteps, the careful placement of objects, formed a map of understanding that required no confrontation, only patient attention. I returned to the dining room, arranging the remaining documents on the table, reviewing each line, each date, noting consistencies and irregularities with a steady, unhurried eye. I walked from room to room, performing familiar tasks, smoothing tablecloths, adjusting cushions, aligning books, each gesture reinforcing the calm authority I maintained and allowing me to silently navigate the dynamics of the family without escalation. The evening shadows deepened, and the golden glow from lamps highlighted the textures and patterns of the home, casting reflections that reminded me of decades of memories, of meals shared, stories told, and milestones celebrated. I paused to take it all in, letting observation, reflection, and quiet patience blend into a deliberate state of awareness, knowing that understanding had matured over the day, forming the foundation for thoughtful decisions to follow. Each movement, each observation, each careful attention to detail reinforced a sense of control and preparation, allowing me to move forward with quiet confidence, fully aware of the household, the relationships, and the subtle currents that would shape the days ahead.